Good afternoon and welcome to Vlog Part 2. So I posted last week, messing up already. I posted last week that I'm going to experiment with vlogging and try and, I don't know, just experiment, see where this takes me, have some fun with it, work on kind of talking with the camera and getting comfortable. So the obvious question then is what to talk about. And I thought, since I've been reviewing books and movies so far on this YouTube channel, then the obvious thing to go next is just talk about my bookshelf. And I thought I'd divide this into three parts. The books I've already read, the long list of books I'm kind of halfway through and kind of currently reading, and then the books that are on my bookshelf that I haven't even started yet, but that I picked up at a bookstore and kind of why I bought them or picked them up and why I might want to read them someday. So today I'm going to talk about the books I've already read. Or to be more specific, so I started doing video reviews of the books I was reading, I think December 2016. But obviously I had been reading books before that point, and in fact I've been reviewing books on my blog for kind of over 10 years now. But there are a bunch of books in my apartment that I had done written reviews of on the blog, but I never did video reviews of. So I thought I'd just kind of quickly go through all those books. Now, it's not as much as you would think, because every time I move countries, I more or less have to get rid of all my books. It's almost impossible to ship books between countries. They're kind of so expensive, they weigh a lot, etc. So the last time I moved countries was when I left Cambodia to come to Vietnam in 2015. Even though Cambodia and Vietnam are right next to each other, I still had to get rid of most of my books. So the only books I kind of have with me are the ones I've read since April 2015. And then from December 2016, I've been starting doing video reviews. So this is kind of like a year and a half of books that I read while living in Vietnam in this current apartment before I started doing the video reviews. Does that make sense? Did I explain that? Anyways, it's just some books that I had on my shelf that I already read that I'm just going to go through real quickly. I know I can be long-winded sometimes. I'm going to try to resist that urge and just kind of go through this quickly. So what have I got here? I've got the Alexandre the Great Trilogy by Renault, or I've got 2 out of the 3 books. The first book was called something like Fire from Heaven, and I actually don't have that book on my shelves anymore. The reason was, at one point, I had all 3 books in this trilogy on my shelf. I had a coworker who was like me. He was a big kind of ancient history nerd. And I said, "Oh, you might enjoy these books. I just finished them." And he said, "Well, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of historical fiction." And he said, "Why don't you just give me the first book and I'll see how I like it." I gave him the first book and I just never heard back from him. I assumed he didn't like it. He didn't give it back to me, but that's okay, because to be quite honest, I'm not going to reread it anyways. It's just, at this point they're just laying around my apartment. Anyways, though, there are 3 books in the trilogy. First one is Fire from Heaven, I think is the name. Second one is called Persian Boy. Third one is called Funeral Games. Now, the reason I read these books is because in a used bookstore I stumbled upon a different trilogy about Alexander the Great by an Italian guy. I think his name was Valerio Massimi Manfredi, or something like that. And I picked those up and I read them, and they were okay but not great. And I was on the internet, and everybody on the internet was like, "Oh, these books are okay, but they're nowhere near as good as Renault's books." Like, everybody on the internet was saying Renault's books and Alexander the Great were the best ever. So I ordered them off of Amazon when I was last back home, collected them, brought them back to Southeast Asia with me, I didn't love them, but to be fair, part of that may have been because I just got done reading a trilogy about Alexander the Great. So like I was kind of retreading a lot of ground I had already read just recently, which may have kind of had an effect on my patience. But I thought Mary Renault, she's a very talented writer, she's very literary, but there's a lot of descriptions, and I thought maybe it was almost a little bit too literary for me. I'm kind of more interested in the narrative, kind of, you know, what happened when and where. So Fire from Heaven is all about Alexander's boyhood. I thought it moved a little bit too slowly for me. Persian Boy is interesting. So there was a eunuch, his name was Bagoas. He's a real historical person. He was a Persian eunuch who was part of the king of Persia's court, who after Alexander conquered Persia kind of became part of Alexander the Great's entourage. Alexander the Great was very fond of him. And there's always been kind of some speculation if this was kind of a homosexual relationship. Much like there's always been kind of speculation about Alexander the Great's sexuality. Mary Renault takes the position that this was a full-on homosexual relationship. What makes this book interesting is this was written before the age of political correctness. This was written way back in 1972. When like this kind of stuff was not mainstream yet. So this is, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, this is one of these famous banned books that used to be banned from libraries. School libraries would not allow it, etc. I think nowadays society has moved a lot further along, but in 1972 this was groundbreaking stuff. So I appreciate this book on that ground, that it kind of broke political ground for its time. As a reader, though, it kind of bored me, and I don't generally like a lot of romantic stories, and this was about Alexander the Great, but there was so much stuff about the romantic relationship, I just got bored with it. So I didn't love the first two books in the trilogy, but I really love the third book. I know, it's strange. You don't like the first two books and then you really like the third book. Go figure. Even though they're all by the same author and they're all in the same trilogy, this book, Funeral Games, is about what happened after Alexander the Great died. And I thought this was fascinating. So I guess if you have a rough idea of history, maybe you know this story in the vague outline. Alexander the Great died with no clear successor to his throne. And then kind of all his friends and generals started fighting with each other. And then his empire just got split into like many different parts. And that's really an interesting story about like all these different people who kind of thought they could kind of, you know, take control of things, and that, you know, one guy's in control for a while, but then he loses power to another guy. It's historical fiction, so there is like, you know, she kind of invents a dialogue and she kind of, you know, imagines the thought process, but it's all based on real history, and it is absolutely fascinating. I love this book. It was so interesting. I know Game of Thrones comparisons are cliche, but I'm going to do it. Like, this is like Game of Thrones storytelling here. You know, it predates Game of Thrones by about 30 years or whatever. But just all these betrayals, all these backstabbings, all these kind of assassinations and stuff like that, and all based on real history. It was a really good book. Okay, moving on. I was in the bookstore here in Vietnam. The selection is limited, but they do have all these kind of Wordsworth classics. And I saw kind of, they had there the complete stories of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. So, everybody knows Mark Twain, everybody knows Tom Sawyer, everybody knows Huckleberry Finn. Some people don't know this, but there's actually two more stories in the Tom Sawyer canon. There's Tom Sawyer Abroad and Tom Sawyer Detective. Now, I was going on Wikipedia and looking some of this up. There are even more stories if you count kind of the unfinished stories that Mark Twain never published in his lifetime. But if you disregard those and you only kind of count the finished stories that Mark Twain published in his lifetime, then there are kind of 4 stories about Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Now, everybody knows about these stories. I had read Tom Sawyer as a child. I had tried to read Huck Finn as a child, but couldn't get through it. I kind of vaguely knew that there were a couple other stories floating around in the canon, but I had never read them. But then I saw these in the bookstore, and I thought, yeah, I'm gonna have a go at this. I want to read kind of all the books in the Tom Sawyer canon. You know, I'm a bit of a nerd. I like to complete the series, and yeah, so I bought these and I read through them. So just briefly then, Tom Sawyer I had actually read once before in 5th grade, but that was a long time ago, so I reread it. Tom Sawyer is just a delight to read, and it was written way back in the 1880s or something. But it's, you know, it's interesting how some books age terribly and some books age very well. I've read a number of kind of Victorian era books where the prose was just kind of stilted and hard to read. Tom Sawyer has aged remarkably well. I mean, like, you could kind of repackage this as a young adult novel and kind of sell it nowadays. And it reads like a modern novel. There's a lot of kind of really funny stuff in it. There's not really much of a plot. It's very kind of episodic. You know, Tom Sawyer and his friends will get kind of into mischief, and then there will be kind of hilarious consequences, and then they'll kind of go on to the next mischief. But it was just really fun to read. Now, Huckleberry Finn, what's interesting about Huckleberry Finn is this is a lot of the kind of the great writers agree that Huckleberry Finn is the greatest American novel of all time. I think like H.L. Mencken says something like, this is the greatest American novel of all time. Hemingway says something like, all American novels come from Huck Finn. He says there is nothing before it. Huck Finn was like the big thing, and everything afterwards has been influenced by Huck Finn. I'm misquoting that because it's from memory. But the point is, like, a lot of really big names in the literary field really love The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, much more so than Tom Sawyer. So that was one of the reasons I kind of had always wanted to finish it, even though I had tried to read it as a child and gave up on it. Huck Finn, boy, where to start with Huck Finn? There is a lot of stuff on there, and a lot of people more intelligent than me have written a lot of commentaries on Huck Finn, so I'm not going to try and give the definitive commentary on this. I'll just maybe comment on my reading experience. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. It was a bit hard for me to get through. Again, I already gave up on it once as a child. I'm older now and have more discipline, but like, it's very episodic. Now, Tom Sawyer is also very episodic, but Tom Sawyer was all about like a lot of fun little anecdotes where there was kind of a very identifiable punchline and humor to it. Huck Finn, they're going down the river and they encounter like all these strange things where there's not really an obvious punchline to all of it. There is humor throughout the book, but there are also a lot of strange episodes that are kind of more social commentary, and I felt like at times the narrative was losing a little bit of forward momentum. You're like, where is this story going? That being said, when it was good, it was very, very good. There are a number of episodes in here that were just absolutely brilliant. It's also, I don't know, Tom Sawyer shows up at the beginning of this book, and then Tom Sawyer shows back up at the end of it. Most critics say that the ending part where Tom Sawyer shows up again is kind of a step backwards in the novel. It's kind of going back to the earlier hijinks of Tom Sawyer. But I kind of like the way these two novels are so interconnected. I don't know. There's a lot more to say about this book. Huck Finn is like one of the greatest of all time. But I'm just going to leave it there because I've got other books to get through. Okay. Tom Sawyer Abroad and Tom Sawyer Detective. These books were published when Mark Twain was desperate for money. And so they're not great works of literature. But they're interesting. So Tom Sawyer Abroad is kind of like Mark Twain is like writing a Jules Verne story. So like there's this kind of magical hot air balloon that can take off and sail all around the world. There's like a mad scientist who invented it. Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and Jim was a character in Huckleberry Finn, get on this, and then they end up kind of taking this trip all around the world. And it's interesting because the original Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn was very realistic. There was some stuff exaggerated for comical effect, but it was all taking place within kind of the real world and the world we lived in. This book all of a sudden is pure fantasy. So it's a bit kind of jarring. I think that this is a bit of an anachronism to call it fan fiction. But I think if this book had been published today in the age of fan fiction, that's the word people would be using to describe it. Like, it just kind of reads like, like some fans decided to take Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and transport them in a completely different genre. That being said, that's kind of part of the fun of this book. If you're not kind of a purist about these things and you kind of let yourself go with it, it's really ridiculous, and in some way, arguably, it's degrading these characters, but in some ways it's just kind of fun. Tom Sawyer Detective is like Mark Twain's take on the Sherlock Holmes stories. This time, like, Tom Sawyer is like the new Sherlock Holmes, and he's solving a crime. Now again, this is completely different than the Tom Sawyer we saw in the original book, who was just kind of an ordinary kid. Now he's like Tom Sawyer, boy genius. And again, if you're a literary critic, you're going to complain about how this is completely spoiling the character. But if you just kind of let yourself go with it, it's all right. The big problem with Tom Sawyer Detective is the reader knows way too much at the beginning. So like the reader already knows a key part to solving the mystery. And you just kind of have to wait for the characters to figure out what the reader already knows. And that, I thought, was kind of poor plotting, and it kind of made the book not as exciting as it could have been. But it's so short and sweet, there's not much to criticize. Okay. 20 Years After by Alexandre Dumas. I actually read this book like 5 years ago. But the reason it's in my bookshelf now is because the wife bought it for me last year as a birthday present. I guess at that time she was still the girlfriend, recently married. And she says, yeah, I thought you would like this book. And I said, oh yeah, I already read this a few years ago. To be fair, I am a difficult person to buy gifts for. So I don't blame her a bit. And to be even more fair, how is she supposed to know that I already read it? And it is exactly the type of book that I would like. So this is 20 Years After. This is Alexandre Dumas. This is part of the Three Musketeers series. There are 3 books in the Three Musketeers series. There's the Three Musketeers. There's 20 Years After, which is the second book. And then there's the 3rd book, which is, I think, called 10 Years After. So that's 10 years after the 20 Years After. So like 30 years after the original Three Musketeers. Now the 3rd book is absolutely huge. So the 3rd book in the English translation is split into like 3 or 4 different books in itself. So I guess kind of like there's 6 books in the Three Musketeers series, but the last 4 are all kind of the same book. Does that make sense? Anyways, the Three Musketeers I absolutely loved. Really fast-paced, really tightly plotted. It's one of those, it's a classic book, but like it doesn't feel like a classic. It feels like a modern spy novel. It's just really fun to read. Each book after that, though, got a little bit slower paced and a little bit more boring until the time you got to the 6th book in the series. I was kind of a little bit losing my patience with it. 20 Years After is not as good as The Three Musketeers, but it's still interesting. It moves a little bit slower, but it's still interesting. So it's 20 years after, so this is 20 years after the events of The Three Musketeers. So the Musketeers are now like 40 or 50, I think. I think D'Artagnan, the youngest one, was younger than the others. So he's about 40, and some of the older ones are about 50, if I'm remembering right. It's really interesting historical fiction. Like, sometimes we, or at least I, kind of tend to think of historical fiction as being kind of something, 20th century. But Alexandre Dumas was writing historical fiction in the 19th century. So he was writing this book in the 19th century, but it's all about the politics of the 17th century. There's a civil war going on in England, kind of, the Puritans fighting against Charles I, sorry. Puritans fighting against Charles I. There's a civil war going on in France, something about the Fronde, I don't really understand it. And the Three Musketeers get kind of involved in both of them, and there's all sorts of real historical figures mixing with fictional characters, and it's kind of a lot of fun if you like historical fiction. The book starts off a little bit slow with kind of an extended roundup scene where we kind of find out we start off with one musketeer and see what he's up to 20 years later, and then we round up and find another musketeer and see what he's doing 20 years later, and it kind of takes a little bit before we get kind of all the musketeers together. But there are some, there's some classic stuff in this book. There's a prison break, and there's secret trapdoors, and there's just it's just some classic 19th century kind of pulp fiction stuff going on here. I recommend it. Of course, don't start with this one. Start with The Three Musketeers. Speaking of Alexandre Dumas, another book he's quite famous for is The Count of Monte Cristo. So, after having finished The Three Musketeers, I decided to do The Count of Monte Cristo next, because that's the other book that Alexandre Dumas is quite famous for. You can see it's a bit of a doorstopper. It's close to 900 pages. Now, I said The Three Musketeers. I said the first book moved really quickly, and then with each book it kind of got more and more slower paced. This has elements of both. The beginning of this book is really great, and the end of the book is really great. I mean, boy, that ending, the last 200 pages or something were something else. I was really kind of hooked for the last 200 pages. But the middle, just drags. It's just so slow. There's this whole section in Italy that just is pointless, and just all these side stories and stuff like that. Of course, some people like that. I was reading one reviewer online who was saying, all the side stories are kind of part of the charm of this book. For this reason, Count of Monte Cristo tends to be popular in the abridged version for people who don't want all those side stories. I'm a bit of a completist. I like to read the whole thing just to say I've read the whole thing. But boy, that middle was a bit of a slog to get through. But the beginning and the end were really great. Okay, moving on. Sherlock Holmes. So this is the complete novels and stories of Sherlock Holmes, Volume 2. Now, why Volume 2? Volume 1 I don't have with me because I read it 10 years ago and it's back at my parents' house in America. I picked up both volumes in a bookstore years ago because I saw them there and I thought, oh right, the complete Sherlock Holmes. I thought, wouldn't that be cool to just kind of buy both volumes, read the whole thing, and then you've got the whole Sherlock Holmes canon under your belt. Yeah, I mean, you could brag to everybody you know that you've read all the Sherlock Holmes stories. So I bought them both and I read the first one and I enjoyed it. And then I took a 10-year break for reasons I'm not really sure. I enjoyed the first one, but I don't know. I guess I just got distracted by other stuff, and I just kept putting off the second one. But eventually I said, okay, I'm going to read the second one. Funny thing though, like now that I've read both books, I find like I don't really remember most of the stories in them, which is always, the older I get, the more I'm discovering it's kind of a losing game trying to be well read. Because the more you read, the more you forget the stuff you've already read. And you like, I'm never going to get to like the status of like the well-read, sophisticated man. It's just a losing battle. Anyways, these, if you haven't read the Sherlock Holmes stories, they're fun reads. These are kind of, a lot of these books, they're kind of classic books, but they're not classic books in like the highbrow sense. They're classic books, and they're in the sense that they're just really popular novels of the day that happen to still be kind of well remembered. And I think Sherlock Holmes exemplifies that perfectly. These are just kind of detective stories. They're really well written detective stories, but there's nothing like highbrow about them. But they're classics because they've survived the test of time. The typical Sherlock Holmes story is about 20 pages, which is about perfect, because you kind of get into it, you're like, oh, what's the mystery, what's the mystery, what's the mystery, and then you can kind of finish it more or less in one sitting, or at the most, if you're a slow reader, you finish it over a couple of days. Now, there are a couple of novels in here as well. The Hound of Baskervilles and The Valley of Fear are novels. The Valley of Fear kind of has some very conservative politics, but I don't really have time to get into that. The Hound of Baskervilles is just classic spooky, you know, like the house on the moors and the fog and this demon dog. It's like a classic Halloween story. It's funny, you know, like the guy who wrote this was writing all these stories over like a period of 50 years. And it's funny, the introduction to one of them, he says, I really hate it when old men come up to me and they said they loved reading my stories as a child. He says, like, these people expect him to be really grateful, but instead he just gets really angry because it just reminds him of how old he himself is getting. And like these stories, I think he started writing them in 1880, but like they go on. Like some of these stories were written during World War I. In fact, one of these stories takes place during World War I, where an older Sherlock Holmes is trying to thwart a German spy. Anyways, they're interesting. I don't have time to talk about everything because I've got a lot of books to get through in this video. Next, after I finished the Sherlock Holmes book, I came upon an Arsene Lupin omnibus. Now, if you don't know who Arsene Lupin is, he is a rough contemporary of Sherlock Holmes. He was written by a French author, but somebody who was writing about the same time as Sherlock Holmes. And Arsene Lupin is kind of a cat burglar who's like a gentleman thief. So he's not kind of a good guy because he's a thief, but he is a good guy because he's got his own kind of code of ethics and code of honor, and he kind of helps out all these people who are in distress. And I thought, Omnibus, it says Omnibus, and I thought, all right, so I just finished all the Sherlock Holmes stories. Why don't I knock out all the Arsene Lupin stories as well? Because I thought omnibus means all, right? Because omni means all in Latin. But actually, omnibus, it turns out omnibus doesn't mean all. It just means a collection. So, you know, that's kind of something useful you can pick up. I'm out of time here, and I still have 3 books to get through. Should we turn this one into a 2-parter? Okay, let's turn this one into a 2-parter. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to upload the second video into a second video. What am I talking about? Okay, I'm going to get a drink of water and kind of collect my thoughts a minute.